there, and welcome to the Drax Files Radio Hour with Jo Yardley. This is a very special show, not just because no Jo Yardley. Joe's going to hate me forever, but we have Richard Bartle on the show. Richard Bartle is the godfather of the virtual world. Why? Because he designed the first MUD or MUD or multi-user dungeon in 1978. What is a multi-user dungeon? Well, it's essentially a virtual world. Maybe more an MMO, but it's all text-based, and you have to type in commands, and then the computer comes back at you and tells you this is what happens. So you tell the computer, look around, and the computer tells you, well, you see nothing because it's dark, and then you say, look on the bottom and floor, and then the computer tells you there's a flashlight, and then you say take flashlight, and the computer goes back to you. So this is a fascinating conversation that took place as part of the Delphi Talks in Space, which is a virtual world made by Sine-Wave Entertainment. And, mea culpa, because I wanted to rotate this show through all different virtual worlds, including space, and we did it a couple of times, and I said by November I will rotate this weekly, and we go to space, and it was just crazy busy. So I'm glad that CEO Adam Frisby is not super angry at me that I didn't come back, because there's a wonderful Drax Files studio, there's a wonderful Drax Files avatar. Long story short, I'm not going to blabber on, because this is a long show and you should listen to its entirety, because Richard Bartle has a lot of wonderful food for thought, especially when it comes to the advancement in virtual worlds with photorealism, with facial tracking. And as a little teaser, you can kind of expect where he would fall in his assessment of that development, which is actually similar to my opinion, is that the more sort of visual eye candy you get, and the more immersive it gets in terms of the realism, make-believe that you're actually in a world, it is less your imagination that fills in the gap. And that may be not a super good thing, just like with a book. I mean, a book is a virtual world where you have to fill in a lot of gaps. You have to create everything in your mind, and so the same with the MUD. But so this is a lengthy show. Richard Bartle is a visiting professor at the University of Essex, and just a few more facts. He created the first MUD in 1978. And right now you can still, and we'll link to it, I think you can still play MUD 2. Richard also wrote a book in 2003 called Designing Virtual Worlds, which I don't have, but I'm ordering it right now. It's pricey, but I need to have it. The talk happened in space and was moderated by Rowan Freeman, who was the chairman of Sine-Wave Entertainment. Vivek Sharma, the non-executive director, and Adam Frisby, the CEO, are also in attendance, and they're going to chime in here and there. We're going to start the show where Richard was asked about the categorization that he came up with, the different player types. He came up with 4 player types. He's going to go into it. And that was in 1989. And it's really fascinating because there's a lot of different categorizations that came after Richard came up with his. Also, in terms of Second Life specifically, what type of residents there are. And, here's Richard giving a little bit background how he came up with that categorization. Enjoy.
So this would be late 1989, and we had some disagreement among the administrators of MUD 2, which was the follow-up to MUD, which I co-wrote. I didn't write it myself, all on my own. I wrote it with Roy Trubshaw. Always got to give Roy a shout out. So if there's any knighthoods going out, he gets one as well. The reason there was a disagreement amongst the wizards or witches. We just call them whizzes for short, because there was a disagreement among them as to what the players enjoyed, because some of the whizzes would come along and try to make the game fun for the players, and other ones would sit around and watch the players and stop it from not being fun. But they had these different concepts of what fun was. And we had this long discussion over the course of several months in what you'd now call a bulletin board. And at the end, I thought I'd summarize it. And I was looking through what people were saying, and I was just putting down what the different sorts of fun they seemed to be identifying were. And I noticed that it fell into 4 main categories, and that the categories were acting on people, acting on the world, interacting with people, and interacting with the world. So I noticed that. I thought, oh, that's quite nice, and told the players. Then sat on it for a bit. I could see it happening in the game and in other people's games. So I was fairly confident that there was at least something in it. Then I wrote up a short version for a magazine. There was I think Comms Plus or something it was called. So I did a version for that. And of course it got shot down. Because they pretty well shot everything down that anybody wrote in that magazine, but never mind. And then when the Journal of Mud Research was launched, I thought, oh, well, I'll write this up as a proper academic paper and submit it, because I wanted to see the journal succeed. It didn't, but it did succeed for several years. It was working, and so that was in the first one, and I was expecting to get shot down again. My main point in writing it wasn't to say, here are the 4 different player types that there are in virtual worlds. My aim was to say, there is more than one player type in virtual worlds. And if you're writing a game for yourself, then you're only addressing one of those types. And you should be addressing all of them, because you need that for a healthy game. I thought it would maybe last about 6 months before somebody came out with a better one, but of course I didn't care about that, because a better one meant that we'd have a better understanding of virtual worlds. But as it happened, it seemed that I did seem to strike the right ones, if you like. So it's held up pretty well over the past 21 years since I wrote the paper. Still gets referenced 3 or 4 times a week in academic circles, which is pretty good.
Yes, I mean it's immediately sort of arresting when you start sort of pulling apart those 4 different categorizations. I have a few questions about it. I know Adam does as well. Before we come on to them, what I would like to do is, just for everybody who's in the room, I've added another button now to the top panel, again right next to Delphi menu, and that says survey. And if you open that, it'll load up what is, I think, one of your former students iterating some analysis that allows us to categorize ourselves.
Not quite. No. This isn't one of my students. This is someone who teaches computer game design at University of Glasgow. Okay. But I did examine his PhD earlier this year.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I knew you had a relationship with him. It's Matthew. Sorry, I've forgotten his name, but we should reference him. Matt Barr. Yeah, that's right. Barr. So now at Glasgow. So so he has created this little form which we can all fill in, and if we can all work our way through it over the course of the talk, at the very end we'll take a group shot of ourselves on a platform that I'll spawn, where we sort of go and stand on the matrix, as it were. But I wonder, Richard, I think I'm right in saying it wasn't you who originally created this questionnaire, was it? Who created the test?
Well, the test is based on that paper that you referenced. So it does ask questions about things that I wrote in my paper. But it was created by let's see, Mark Andreessen and another guy whose name I can't bring to mind immediately. But they wrote this thing pretty well immediately after the paper was published. So it was out in 97, something like that, and it ran for many years. It used to be the longest running questionnaire on the internet, but after 850,000 times being filled in, it had been passed between different websites that kept getting bought up by other ones, and the last owners, it didn't fit in with what they had in mind for their website, so it disappeared. Which is why Matt Barr wrote his. It's kind of to replace the other one. It's not the only one. Yeah, the original one. Yeah.
So while people are filling that out, hopefully you can see it on your screen. There is a close. Once you actually get to the bottom of the form itself, which is a web page that we're loading on your canvas there, there's an I'm not a robot bit at the bottom, and then a button you press at the bottom of the survey that will then take you to the results. And we want you to remember the result, essentially where on the matrix you are, if you don't already know. And then at the end of the talk, like I say, we'll all go and take a group shot together. There is also a close button there that just closes the tab. So if you're halfway through filling out the form and you want to see the room again, you can click close and then open it again and just carry on. It's the Bartle Me button in the form itself that will submit it and show you immediately your result. We did want to do an aggregate thing, but then I realized I didn't quite have time to actually work out the logic behind these questions and generate something in Google Forms that would give us a meaningful aggregate result. But we'll go and stand somewhere. And actually, one of the things we were hypothesizing, Richard, when we talked about doing this event and having the audience fill out this form, was a general feeling that people might be a bit shy. There's the one rather sort of contentious or socially sort of awkward potentially category of killer, which I wonder whether we might be a little bit thin on the ground for killers, at least confessing themselves to be killers. It's a slightly odd categorization, that one, isn't it? Because outside of games, it's kind of socially unacceptable to kill people, isn't it?
Well, the word killer there was pretty. If I hadn't have used the word killer, then people wouldn't have noticed the test. So the word killer there is the one that really brought it to notice. But actually, it's people who like acting on other people. And in a mud context, in a game world context, then they tend to want to act on them by hitting them with things. But they don't have to act on them like that. They can act on them in other ways. They can do it by verbal bullying or spreading lies, or otherwise getting into conflict with people who don't want to be in conflict. That's one way that they can do it. There is a second kind of person who likes acting on other people, and these are the ones who are less. They're not griefers. They're more the guild leaders. So they see they're like politicians. They like telling people what to do as an organizer in order to help the game world, rather than in order to enjoy themselves by being a jerk. So that category there has got two main subcategories: the actual griefer type, which is where the killer gets its name, and the politician subtype, which is not so
violent, potentially.
People don't like politicians, do they? But
at least not quite so bloodthirsty necessarily. So
yes, depends on the politician, I guess.
Yeah, Adam, and did you let me bring you in on this then? Because Adam, you were talking before about potentially the whether this sort of taxonomy gets updated in the wider world of virtual worlds beyond sort of MMOs, in which sort of overcoming the monster is the primary goal.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a slightly different ballgame when you've got more social-oriented virtual world experiences. I mean, what are the axes that would fit along here? Because obviously the achiever is not necessarily. I mean, you find that virtual worlds probably. I mean, I don't know, Richard. I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but the more open-ended and creative ones, I imagine they sort of balance towards. I mean, the people you would qualify as socializers and potentially achievers, but I'm not sure explorers definitely too, but sort of that killers aspect doesn't really come along, and really the achievers not so much either.
you do get the killers. I mean, we all saw the dancing penises in Second Life, but
so that you would classify that as killers. Anyone who's griefing is yes. Is
well, if they're doing it in order to
bully.
Well, if they're doing it to impose themselves on other people without their consent, then that would be the way you'd look at it. I do think that I do think that player types apply to non-game worlds, to social worlds, because back in the day, when for the first 10 or more, 12 years of existence of virtual worlds, they were shared by socializers and gamers. They all played them together. So there was this kind of balanced world which had a game aspect to it, but the people who were playing were socializers and achievers, kind of in an equilibrium. But when the concept of MUDs reached the US, it arrived through a game called Abermud from the University of Aberystwyth, which was more on the hack and slay side, and that put a lot of people off in the US. So they rewrote the virtual world as a concept without combat in it, without fighting, and without any game aspect to it. And that's where we got the moos, mushies, mucks, and all the social worlds from. That meant that the social players had a choice now. They could play in a regular game world, or they could play with other mainly socializers. So what happened was that they would go to play the social worlds. That meant the brakes were off for the people left in the game worlds who were more on the game side. So they rewrote everything as purely game hack and slay type of Diku mud, if you like. And there's a whole bunch of those LP muds. They were all in the game side. So we had this great schism in about 1989 to 1991, round about there, where the social world split and then the game world split, leaving the balanced worlds bereft of players, because if you were a gamer, you'd go to one. If you were not a gamer, you'd go to the other. Now, because of that, for many years, social worlds would that the players would try to separate themselves away from the game worlds, because from their point of view, they were definitely not those game worlds. But the game worlds themselves still regarded the social worlds as being a version of them. So the games people would be calling Lambda Moo a mud, whereas the Lambda Moo players would certainly not be calling themselves a mud. They might reluctantly have MU star as an acronym for as an umbrella term. And this is something which we've had now. Both of these, particularly the social worlds, seem to define themselves as not being game worlds, which is why something like Science Space is quite interesting, because it's a social world which is intended to be used in part for making game worlds. So the 30-year
it's almost a circle going round, isn't it? Yeah, it's very interesting what you're saying, because it almost resonates with the very big. It's almost like a precursor of the very big political social trend that people talk about a lot at the moment, of these sort of echo chambers of affinity groups becoming sort of siloed. Do you think it's that was essentially the same process that we see now with people in sort of political echo chambers on social media? In a way, it resonates with that.
It resonates, but virtual worlds have always been about identity. That's the whole point, is that you play the game in order to be and become yourself. And if it's not a game, you visit the world to be and become yourself. It gives you freedoms that you don't have in the real world. And some people will take their choice of virtual world as part of that identity, and therefore they don't want it challenged by saying, well, it's just like that, when they don't think it is just like that. There's some of that to it. And of course, if you are sharing a world with people who are like-minded, then you will end up gravitating towards similar opinions. And if you don't, then you leave for another virtual world, which is more either up your street or more challenging, or whichever you want.
Sean, we've got Sean on the AV who has brought up on our screens the taxonomy that you created, or a visualization of that taxonomy. Sean, I wonder whether you could just bring up the other image that I gave you earlier. I just want to ask Richard. Richard, you can look at the screen behind you by clicking the screen button on the top.
Okay.
If you want to.
Yeah, right.
But
I got it.
Have you got it? And then there's a look away button if you want to afterwards. But I just wanted to ask if I'll just wait for Sean's image to appear. Let me just make sure he is getting it. Sean, can you?
Such a better image than the one I use in my lectures.
I do. We just found that one on the internet, but I'm just getting Sean to bring up another one that I just want to sort of cross-reference against it, particularly in relation to what Adam was saying about whether virtual worlds today cover a different spectrum, or whether this maybe is the same spectrum iterated in a different way. Sean, have you got that link? It's actually just the standard Jungian archetype. So I think Sean's got an issue bringing it up. Maybe I'll just go and see if I can bring it up as well. Hold on. Oh, screen's gone blank. I'm just going to see if I can bring it up. Hold on. I'm just going to run over there because I think Sean's machine is messing up. Hold on a second.
Well, the while you're working on that, the player types thing is it describes people who play all kinds of virtual worlds for fun. And it's therefore interesting to people who are interested in looking at fun. But if you're not interested in looking at fun, if you're interested in looking in some other dimension, well, it won't be any use to you at all. So if you are particularly interested in different ways that people create, well, you wouldn't really necessarily be interested in that form of player types. Okay.
Here we go, Ron. We've got your image.
There we go. So I just brought up an image there, and I just wanted to. Oh, is it still there, or is it?
You just wiped
it. Hold on. Browser. Oh, there we go. There we go. We're back. Yeah.
Yep.
I need to click the look away without getting rid of. There we go. So this is a sort of standard sort of iteration of the Jungian archetypes, and I just wanted to have a look at it and see: is this the same? Is this the same taxonomy? Some of it appears the same. Adam and I were talking about this earlier, and I'm wondering where the killer was. But I suppose the killer is really the king, isn't it? It's about that. That's the person who's there for power.
Maybe it depends. No, it's a hero, wouldn't it be?
Well, the hero's the achiever, isn't he?
What do these people find fun? What is it that the individuals on this list find fun about their existence in a virtual world? Well, therein lies your answer. I mean, if someone's wants power, they could want power for good. They could want power over society, but they could want power over individuals. They could want power over a particular individual. They might want power over the environment, in which case that would be more to do with more an achiever kind of thing. I mean, there are probably connections between the Jungian, which it goes all the way back to the four humours of medieval times. But these are to do with personality types, and personality isn't the same as what you're finding fun in a virtual world. And part of the reason for that is as you play in a virtual world, you will change player type. So Every year I get my new batch of final year students and I sit them down and make them play Mud. And they have a wonderful time for about 2 hours, never play it ever again because it's text. But the first thing that they do when they get into the game, it'll be one of two things. Either they'll just go around trying absolutely everything, or they'll go around killing each other. Now, what they're doing there is they're exploring the boundaries of that space. One of them is exploring the physical boundaries, and one of them is exploring the social boundaries. So the opportunists are doing the physical boundary, and the griefers are doing the social boundary. Now, after a while, they learn the boundaries and then they move on. I mean, because if you are a killer, it's not really a sustainable position. You aren't going to be one for very long unless you've got a particular reason for wanting that. Most people will pass through that phase. Some people will stick there. Others will return to it later on, particularly if something bad happens to them and they get a grudge. So after that stage, then they start in the exploring the stage. Now, some of them will start exploring scientifically, where they'll be doing little experiments. What happens if I jump off this cliff? Will it kill me or not? Others will be exploring in the social sense. They'll be asking other people how to do things, asking other people who what the best guilds are, and so on. So there's this social aspect to it, and you've got both streams. The social world and the game world are the players are progressing along them. Then after that stage, you get to the main part, which will be for a games player. It will be the classic achiever sort of area, where the players are attempting to beat the game on its own terms. But you also get the ones who get more involved in the community and become community leaders. And so they would be on the social side. And at the very end stage, you get which, I mean, I never get beyond the first couple of stages when I'm doing this for my students because I don't have long enough. But after 2 years or more of playing one of these, any virtual world, the players will eventually end up either as gurus who just know everything, so they can tell you exactly how to do something and exactly what will happen if you try something, even though no one's ever tried it before. They'll sort of know how it would work. Or they end up as friends, which is another kind of socializer, and they'll just hang around with each other, just enjoying each other's company and doing things just for fun. So you've got those like 4 steps, and each step is down either a social track or along a game world track. And normally people will start off as a killer, then they're going to be like a scientist kind of explorer, then they'll go on to be a mainstream achiever, and then they'll go off to be a socializer, hanging out with their mates. So when you've got a virtual world like World of Warcraft, and people have been playing it for 10 years, they all think of themselves as being achievers or being explorers, but most of those players probably socializers.
Yeah, at this stage, it sounds that path from killer through to socializer also resembles me through my first 4 cups of coffee every morning. It's exactly the same narrative path.
Right, yes.
Adam, Diggy, do you want to come in? Because I think we'll move the conversation onto the world of storytelling. I was going to actually ask how these archetypes, Richard. I suppose the key question is: shouldn't they be? What am I saying? Which of those? Does one of those archetypes have the lead role in storytelling in the world? Or the lead responsibility for storytelling, or I think your hypothesis originally was that all 4 of them have to be present in order for proper organic storytelling to take place. Is that?
Well, okay. So this is when you play in a virtual world. When you're in a virtual world, events happen, things happen. Some of these things are worth remembering, telling other people, whether inside the world, outside the world, or telling yourself. And the retelling of selected events is what makes something a story. So if you were telling the story here of this presentation, or well, not present, this panel so far, then you might pick up some of the things, well, we did this and we did this and we did this, but you probably miss out things like we had a bit of problem with sound at the beginning, because that's not part of the story that you will be telling. So events happen, people select from the events which events they're going to retell. Those events in the retelling are a story. And there's usually some causal relationship between the events. You don't just say, well, you know, got up, went to the shop, bought myself a Mars bar, went home, read the paper. I mean, because these aren't connected. There's not a way, there's not a narrative going on there. You'll be saying this happened, but I didn't like that, but then this happened. Then, so there's a connection. Now, that means that in order to have a story, these are emergent stories I'm talking about here, events have got to occur. Now, where those events occur from, if they're from a game designer or an environment designer, then those can be created to fit a storytelling pattern. But most events in games are, and not just games, I mean, in any virtual world, the events that happen are happening because of the actions of other people. So, killers, for example, can cause a lot of drama because they're jerks. They make people do things they don't want to do. They get under your skin. They annoy you. And that gives you something to talk about. So they're a catalyst, a much bigger catalyst than, say, an achiever is. But you don't want too many of them, because otherwise it's like putting too much pepper in your meal. You want a couple of shakes, but you don't want the whole pot. And you can't say that the killers are creating the story, because that's not what they themselves, they don't see themselves as story creators. They see themselves there as being people who are just in there to have some fun at the expense of others. But in the process of doing that creates a conflict, which leads to drama, which leads to story, because of the events that unfold.
Well, that sort of, yeah. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, I mean, that sort of brings up the question of actually, can you tell stories in virtual worlds? We had a bit of a brief conversation a few weeks ago about when we first talked, and that was about the question of sort of how to actually tell stories in virtual worlds to begin with. And I think that there's been very few cases of actual sort of large multiplayer environments that have successfully tried to tell a story.
Yeah. Well, virtual worlds are just like the real world, but virtual. So can you tell stories in the real world? Well, obviously you can. And there are multiple channels for telling stories. And some of them are individual private channels, like you read a novel. Some of them are events where you would go and watch a movie, or with hundreds of other people, or with just a small number of people. You might watch a television. You might go to a play and acting in a play. So there are many ways in the real world that we have stories, and you can have those in a virtual world. Except in a virtual world, it's much harder to control people who want to disrupt the storytelling experience. So if you go to a theatre and people are on stage and somebody in the audience starts throwing marbles at them, well, what's going to happen? That person in the audience is going to be removed, physically removed. Now, in a virtual world, yeah, they can be physically removed, but then they've got another character and they come back and they start throwing worse than marbles. It's a lot harder to control people, and particularly since people feel a lot more freedom to act irresponsibly. So if you're watching some people acting on a theatre in a virtual world, you'd better have some kind of lock on the door, only letting people who you know, and when you eject them, then you don't let anybody else in, which is a bit like what they have in the real world, but it's kind of limited.
Well, I'm thinking in terms of the actual overall narrative. I mean, there are MMORPGs with plots. I mean, World of Warcraft has done a plot over the course of the game, but there's very little actual back and forward between the player base and the designers and developers, and it seems to sort of be that element where the players actually have some degree of control. I mean, ultimately, most MMOs are pretty much as static as a painting. That is, you can look at it, you can look at it from different angles, but ultimately you can't sort of get in there and change it and pervert the story or be the actual hero. I mean, it's always a bit of a false narrative that you are the hero in the story because everyone else is the hero too.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's actually been any real big cases where, I mean, obviously it's difficult to do as a designer and developer. I mean, God knows what it would take to have sort of the team on the back end letting you dictate the narrative. But I mean, have you seen examples of that?
Yeah. Okay, so the two, as I said, there's emergent narrative, which happens, and that's kind of the what makes games better. Well, not games. What makes digital worlds better than regular static movies and things is because you do get that interaction bearing out events, which causes the stories. So
yeah, I'm just thinking. Did you ever see
creating them?
Oh, sorry,
but
we're going to delay here. Did you ever see A Tale in the Desert?
Yeah, A Tale in the Desert. But if you're thinking of story, then the one to go for would be Eve Online.
Really have one, but I mean that was the case in point of emergent gameplay across a wide audience. But
the thing is that if you just leave it to events, a lot of people really aren't all that good at creating events. They're not really good at doing things, and they find it boring. They call it grinding if they're doing something without purpose to it. So people who are good at creating stories can therefore help them along by building quests to add a layer of rationale to what they're doing in order to give it more meaning than it would be if they were just, I need to kill 1,000 furbolgs, I'll just go and kill 1,000 furbolgs. So they're giving it meaning. Now, this means that you can follow proper story structure and so on, and there are virtual worlds that do that. But the problem is that these stories, as you say, are essentially single player. And if you're playing a massively multiplayer game, then, I remember Star Wars: The Old Republic. There I am. I've just got my own fleet. I'm in charge of everything. And the very next thing I'm asked to do is to go and help some guy in a cave who's lost his friend. I've got a space fleet, and you want me to... I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You can't all be heroes. I mean, it's that thing, there's a Gilbert and Sullivan song about it where everybody gets made into bishops and generals, and eventually nobody's a bishop or a general because everybody is. It's...
absolutely. I would be very interested to see how this progresses over the next sort of 30 years or so. I could easily see like AI designers building regions at the pace that could follow that narrative where you grab 3 of your mates and it suddenly turns into a big grand arching narrative that you can control.
Yeah. I mean, there are some things which you would need in those kind of narratives which players aren't really ready for. The possibility of failure, for example. The virtual world with the best stories at the moment is EVE Online, and those stories are entirely emergent from interaction between players at high level corporate in wars and so on. And that's all that is. I mean, that's the players really do have agency, and they really can do things in the game world. They're not just running along a track that tells them if you get on this track, then you'll have a really good story, and at the end of it, you'll enjoy it. Another thing that would help, which players, well, maybe the players would be okay with it, but the developers aren't, is to have a story that ends. So once you've become the head honcho in the galaxy, well, that's it. Well done. Game over. Here's your 3D printed version of your character. Off you go. I mean, imagine if you had a game that was something like escaping from a prisoner of war camp. That final escape run when you're running away, you're trying to get away, and you've got an hour of absolutely intense experience. When you finish that game and you've reached it back to your home country, you're going to be elated, you're going to love it, and you're going to want to play another game by that same company. And your story's over. There's no reason to go back into the prisoner of war camp again, because the whole point was to get away from it. Now, that's something again which we're not going to see for ages, because these games are just too expensive to make, and people who are paying for them to be made, they want to retain players. They don't want to lose them. Because when they lose them, they might come back to the same game, but then they might go to a different game.
Well, it's a very interesting point, because essentially what you're saying is that the default type of story that game designers are trying to create is essentially what one might call an epic, right? A story that just goes on and on and on, keeps you coming back, has lots of leveling up, has you becoming a sort of, master of the universe character at the end, and goes on through many sort of generations of chapters and so on and so forth. That isn't the only type of story that's out there, though. I mean, you can tell a story in a haiku, you can tell a story in a 30-second caption of a Tom and Jerry cartoon where one guy hits the other guy over the head, and then that drags in some other guy, poor innocent observer, who then ends up beating both of the original protagonists. The stories can play out in much, much shorter time loops, and to my mind, it ought to be possible to create a universe that you stay in that has lots and lots of little stories that do end.
Yeah, what they try to do with quests, which are they're not that short as you're saying. I mean, individual combats might be that short, but a quest will be multiple steps, and that each one of them is a story with a beginning, middle, and an end. And they try to give you more than one at the same time, so it's like a soap opera. So when one quest ends, you're already involved in two others, and when one of those ends, there's still another two that you're involved in. So although the stories end, there is an unlimited supply of stories which keep going on. Now, the problem of everybody's a hero, you can reduce that by massively reducing the number of players per game server. So instead of having 10,000 per server, you have 250 or something like that per server, and then making the artificial intelligence characters have their own goals, which is what we were saying earlier, so that the stories emerge from the interactions between AI characters, not just between player characters. So if there's a powerful Guild of Magic users character who wants to take over the country, and you've got a bunch of farmers who don't like the way magic is sucking the life out of their plants, well, you've got some kind of a conflict set up there automatically. You don't have to code that in as a human, saying that would be a great fight, but you can arrange the parameters within which these events occur so that there's a greater chance of particular ones happening than others. But ultimately, if you really wanted to go ahead, you could have a 500 years, 5,000 years, take how many thousand years you want, have a virtual world in which you are the only player and all the other players are non-player characters, but they don't know they're non-player characters, they think that you're one as well. than you can be.
Interesting. I want to start opening up to some questions from the floor, because I can see in chat that lots of people are sort of commenting around the subjects that we're discussing. I also just want to encourage people, if they haven't done so already, to finish their survey. I will hide that button soon, so there is some time pressure on you if you haven't done your homework to fill it out. Sean, I'm going to ask you if you can start gathering some questions from the audience, and we'll start reading them out. Diggy and Adam, do you want to just step in while we organise those? And
sure. I wanted to ask about instancing in storytelling. Like lots of MMORPGs are doing single-player instances as well as group instances, creating mini side stories and changing the world as the user progresses on the story. Do you think that's a good idea? Because while they're in the instance, they're also cut out from all the other player base, because they can't see each other unless they are a solo instance or a group instance.
Yeah, this is one of the problems with massively multiplayer games. You think you're playing with 10,000 other people, but actually you're playing with 5 in this one instance. Or you're playing alone in one instance. The presence of the other players is necessary to give meaning to what you're doing, because otherwise you may as well just go off and play Skyrim.
Yeah.
So the presence of the other players validates what you're doing, and for social players, so that's the killers, politicians, general socializers. It's essential that you have other players, because they're on the that's what they like acting on or interacting with, is other players. And if you create a world which is fragmented like this, well, I mean, there are practical reasons why you would want to do it, but it does make the world less of a world. And it's again, if you were to reduce the number of players per server, then you would have this ability for people to wander around, and they might be walking through a wilderness and never see another soul, but you can do that anyway in most virtual worlds, because everyone's in an instance. It does tell players. All games. All games that are the designer is attempting to communicate something to the players, whether the designer wants to or not.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that I think that there's been a definite trend in MMOs towards smaller and smaller instances, and focusing more on even a sort of a single player with adjacent multiplayer experience. I think all the new modern MMOs from the new Old Republic definitely was single player almost. Secret World is basically single player.
Massively single player.
I think they just revamped it to make it even more single player recently.
Even WoW and ESO are the same.
Yeah. And I think that possibly comes from the fact that a lot of what is in the more multiplayer focused MMOs, it's just too hard to coordinate with other people, and it becomes not fun when you're sort of waiting around for 2 hours to have a 10-minute experience.
Some of the things that you want to do, you can't do in modern MMOs because there are too many other players who will stop you doing it. Things like if you're in say the Secret World Legends, which I was playing like 3 hours ago. In there, what happens if you drop an object on the floor? It disappears. Why does it disappear? Because otherwise people would drop things on the floor for real money. So I will drop something on the floor for real money, so that you can pick it up and now you've got it. So in order to stop the real money trading, they stop all trading. So you can't sell anything to anybody else except through an auction house. Now that takes away from the world. It stops the world from being a living, breathing environment, just because some players want to make a quick buck. And there's other things as well, communication, whereas some players will just start talking about politics or yesterday's football match or how they would change the game if they really wanted to, and other players want to do role-playing, and you can't do that in the same world if there are people with conflicting agendas. But if you have a smaller world and you give the players control over who enters, well, then they can kick people out if they turn out to be the wrong sort of person. The danger you get then is that their version of who the wrong sort of person might be, oh, you're black, you're gay, you're male. You can get people kicked out for the completely invalid reasons.
You've talked about this sort of. I'm going to come to some of the questions from the audience in a second. We've got a handful that have kind of going to come to them. I'm just going to ask a question myself. You've talked about the sort of, the difference between the storytelling that the game designer offers to the users, which I think there's a general consensus in terms of good, robust, meaningful storytelling in a massively multi-user environment is very hard to deliver, certainly in a cost-effective and satisfying way. And then there's the emergent stories that the players themselves develop as a consequence of them, as you say, editing their own histories, almost as it were. But isn't the Holy Grail, isn't what we're trying to do to essentially to create the infrastructure, the rule set, the tools in world for, I don't know if this is a meaningful term or not, but essentially user-generated storytelling to actually streamline the process of creating what are essentially quite well documented and easy to understand narrative structures of overcoming the monster and the hero's journey, and a romantic comedy where two people meet and then are pulled apart and have to come back together again. When you think about what we render in a virtual world, why isn't it easier for us to hand to users tools that make it easy to tell satisfying stories and to sort of to move along, to move your own story along in a way that is emotionally compelling?
Okay, so there's a distinction between user-generated content, which is the emergent sort of content, and user-created content, which is the user as editor of the world content. User-generated content is generally good, but it can be traumatic, and you can also miss out on it because you don't get into the right places or because you haven't got the right kind of imagination. User-created content, the original reasons people wanted it wasn't because they thought they'd get better stories, but because it was a lot cheaper than that, paying somebody to make the content. What you find is that most of the content is either some kind of giveaway or it's a death trap. So the content that people create, the stories that, or whatever it is that people create, will either be people attempting to, it'll be so easy because the people who create it want to get lots of plaudits for how wonderful they are, and by making something easy and simple and not challenging, they can do that. Or it will be a death trap. People are lured in because they like the sound of it, and everything that happens there is ghastly, bad, and horrible. And if you look at the player types, then you can see why that would be. I mean, the killers are obviously going to be people who are going to try and lure people in and then hit them hard with something horrible. The socializers are going to want to have lots of people. They want to please them. The achievers will do whichever one of them is going to advance them the most. So getting people to like their stuff or getting visitors is probably going to do it, so they'll make it easier. And the explorers, they're probably going to make it very, very complicated, which for other explorers is going to be quite fun, but for everybody else is going to be like a death trap. So those are for people who are creating it for fun. But there are, as I said, player types only cover people who play virtual worlds for fun. There are people who play them not for fun. For example, teachers, journalists, real money traders, and game designers or world designers. And if some of the players will be transitioning into or actually be world designers, and those players will create good content, as in the content which everybody really wants. The trouble is everybody thinks that they're one of these players and not one of the other players. They all think that they've got the creativity. So you end up with the discoverability problem, like everybody who's written a book and put it onto the Amazon Kindle and wonders why no one's reading it, or the 1.5 million games that have been uploaded to the Android store. Well, yeah,
which should never get played. Yeah, understood. So let me come to some of the questions in the from our audience. Tom Sawyer asks if you think game designers can influence or change player types, and then he has a follow-up question about people who play as killers. Does that lead them to killing people in real life? I don't think it does, but to soften the edges of that question slightly, I suppose I would be interested in your thoughts about it was everyone in media has for years been very sort of dismissive of the idea that the sort of just relentless consequence-free violence in film and games and televisions has no impact on society. It seems rather stupid to think that it sends people into the streets to kill each other, but it doesn't have no impact at all, does it? It must have some kind of effect on us as a society. So 2 questions. One is about designers influencing player types, and the other, I suppose, is any comments you have on the broad, subtle impact of the nature of certainly the mass content that's out there.
Okay. So the first question was, can designers influence player types? Designers can design to encourage or discourage particular player types. They can also design to help players progress through the player types, because if you know that someone who is like a scientist, explorer, is generally going to progress on to becoming an achiever, then you can start introducing achiever style quests or material stories as people progress through the explorer style content. So they can do that, they can help them along. As for changing people's personalities, it's not about personalities. Virtual worlds are about individual freedom. Helping people to explore who they are and find out who they are and be themselves. I mean, that's pretty well what they're about. And there is a hero's journey which maps onto that, but I'm not going to go through that because as at least one person in the audience knows, Austin Tate, that takes 2 hours and is kind of boring. Your second question, assuming that I've answered the first one to a reasonable.
Tom will follow up if he has any
sufficiently well. The second question was about virtual worlds on society as a whole. Now, when Roy Trubshaw and I created Mud, we wanted to change society as a whole, because we wrote Mud because real society sucked. We really didn't like the real world, and we wanted to do a better one. So we gave it some competition. That was our idea. And so the aim is to change society, because if you can show that there's a better world than what society has, then society has some questions to answer. Now, obviously, we didn't have quite the computer power that we would have needed to be able to do that. But in a few, I don't know, again, how many hundreds of years do you want? We will have computer worlds that will be able to sustain people's existence for a long period, and they will be better than the real world in some ways. And then the real world will be having to argue why it should have primacy. Now, in terms of making people going out into the street and killing everybody, well, no, that's not happened. What the people who there's a psychology literature on games is generally about 70% about games and aggression, another 25, maybe 20% on games and addiction, another 5% on children, maybe 5% on everything else. So the vast majority of the work done by psychologists on computer games concerns games and aggression, and they consistently find that computer games cause people to be aggressive. But when you look at the nature of the experiments, some of them are bizarre. Things like, I'm going to give you a word and tell me what the two missing letters are. It's the same letter. K-I blank blank. What letter is it? And it turns out that if someone's been playing Grand Theft Auto for half an hour and you suddenly stop them in the middle of it, they'll say L. But if someone's been playing Tetris and they're bored out of their mind for half an hour and you take them out of it, they'll say S. But L's cognate with violence, so therefore playing Grand Theft Auto makes you violent. The problem they have is that people have been playing computer games for decades, and if they really did make people violent, the streets should be running with blood, but they're not running with blood. If playing games makes you violent, then why on earth are they experimenting on people? That's like saying, we think that if I give you this drug, it'll turn you into a killer. Here, take some of the drug. Oh, yes, it's turned them into a killer, all right. Let's try it on someone else. But you wouldn't do that. That would be crazy.
Well, not without some serious bulletproof grasp between you and your subject. Anyway, but I think there's but isn't there? So that's talking about a very direct causal relationship, a sort of literal causal relationship from playing violent games to being violent. But isn't it reasonable? I don't know if you're aware of any research that looks at this. Isn't it more likely that the impact of what to a certain extent is a very, very wall-to-wall almost comprehensive portrait of consequence-free violence in film and games.
Does
that have another impact? Does that have another impact on society, like almost a more numbing impact?
No, I don't think so. It's not consequence-free. If you play first-person shooters, which are the big ones, I mean, they call them ego shooters in Germany. They really don't like them. But if you play one of those, 50% of the time you die.
Well, yeah, but it's consequence-free in that you can shoot people without going to jail or being considered a moral reprobate.
Yes, but it shows people they know what it's like to be on the receiving end, not just on the dealing end. And if you say, yeah, well, look, it's great, I can go out there and shoot all these other people and they all die, maybe I'll do that in the real world. But if you do it in the game world, you die half the time. And if you go into the real world, you're pretty well going to die all the time. I mean, it's not consequence-free. It does tell you things about both sides. If it were consequence-free, then people certainly wouldn't go into the real world and do it, because I know the real world's not consequence-free, but the game is, so let's do it in the game. And there are arguments that people make that because it's in a game and you're actually acting in a game, you'll get some kind of muscle memory, which means that when you go out into the real world, then you'll just find it that much easier to do these things. And in part, you can see why they would be doing that, because if that weren't true, then the entire serious games industry would be a waste of time. But on the other hand, there are arguments that serious games haven't lived up to their expectations, and perhaps that's because much of what they want to teach isn't the kind of thing that games are very good at teaching. Games are very good at teaching things like facts and very good at teaching high-order problem solving, and they're very good at giving people social skills, but they're not very good at teaching you how to shoot an M15 rifle or whatever it is and throw grenades under railway trains.
No, I think the place for certainly 3D serious games is, there are particular delineations. Some of them are to do with social skills, actually training social environments and diagnostic environments, and some of them are to do with very, very particular spatial things.
It depends what they're teaching.
It's not a universal.
I'm not trying to tar them all with the same brush, but what I am saying is that much of the argument used as a general argument against games isn't used as a general argument against serious games. What you just said as well, there's a few there that they're very specific. Well, yeah, but there might be a few games which are very specific and are very bad for you. Last year around this time, I was at a conference in the US, Project Horseshoe, where game designers were split into groups, and our group was discussing how to weaponize games, how to make games overthrow society, injure people, cause mental illness. And it turns out it's really, really easy to do that. Just that games designers are kind of responsible, so we don't.
That sounds horrifying and fascinating at the same time. To avoid asking you to encourage us or tell us all how to go about doing that, I'm going to move on to another question. We are a little bit pushed for time as well, so I'm going to rattle through a few more questions, and then I'm going to hopefully everyone has filled in their survey, knows what type of player they are, isn't embarrassed to admit that they're a power-hungry political killer. Those of us that are, and we'll move to do our group photo. Just let me rattle through a few. A few more of the audience's questions as well. Dave Rage asks very simply, what is the best MMO in your opinion around at the moment? This is so he's called Dave Rage. It's Andrej. He says it's obviously someone you know, I think.
The best one from what perspective?
Well, just
the best if you're a moneymaker would be World of Warcraft. The best if you're a hardcore game player would be EVE Online. The best if you want story would be The Secret World.
Your favourite?
My favourite, because I'm a game designer, is the one that's got the best game design, and that would be The Secret World. Not The Secret World Legends, but the original Secret World that has some things of beauty from a game design perspective in it. But EVE Online is also very, very good. Very good design. World of Warcraft's very good design. I mean, there are other ones that are on the way that look like they're going to be very good, but they've not been launched yet. Crowfall, which has elements of both kinds of story in it, as in it's got the player-generated story lasts for about 3 months, and essentially you're trying to take over individual planets, and you get actual consequences there. It's quite good. But then there's other games like Minecraft, which has got barely any gameplay to it, but nevertheless is attractive for people who like building things, who are very, very similar. So really depends what you're aiming at, but for a game design point of view, yeah.
What is it about the one that you mentioned? Is it the Secret Universe or the Secret World? Secret World. Yeah. So what was it about that you found beautiful from a game design point of view? What are the components of that are elegant?
Okay. Well, it had this skill wheel. Essentially, as you played, you gathered skills, and you built up various different abilities, and you could combine them. So it was like a deck building game. But the actual wheel that they had, where you're building your deck, was a thing of beauty. It was absolutely things would interact in wonderfully subtle ways. I loved that. It was really, really good. It's a shame that the Secret World Legends doesn't do something similar, but I can see why they didn't. No, that was great. And then they brought out a Tokyo expansion, completely changed the gameplay and ruined it. But never mind.
Well, nothing lasts forever. Okay, I'm just going to dig up one more question, then I'm going to ask everybody if they can join us for our group photo at the end. unfortunately, every time I drag my thing up, I'm losing the chat question. Who else? So we had a question about the where is it? Just let me scroll up if people stop typing chat here. So a question about where are we? What do you think? Oh, well, okay. So this is a question from Julie, and it's particularly pertinent to us because we're about to release this, asking what you think the impact of sort of greater levels of immersion, particularly sort of things like real-time facial capture. We're just about to release real-time facial capture in here. And, when people start bringing their hands in without having to wear suits or anything, just, cameras capturing and pattern recognition on hand movement and so on and so forth. I mean, I suppose to add to that question myself, I've always had this hypothesis that one of the things that's important about a virtual world is essentially the unwitting testimony. It's the idea that you betray things about yourself unconsciously to the other people around you, and that is actually the foundation of trust, and that's why bonds are built that are more important than your character. You might pretend to be a vampire or a werewolf or whatever it is, but if you're a massive bore or an incredible narcissist, or if you're very caring and you actually are considerate of other people, then you're going to betray that about yourself in the sort of social assault course of a virtual world. So with that in mind, what do you think that the full immersion of real-time facial expression and things like that will change people's relationships with each other in games and with the game designer?
Well, what you were saying about the revealing parts of yourself to other players, that's true. But what you get with a virtual world is something else, which is that you reveal parts of yourself to yourself. By pretending to be somebody else, you get to see yourself as others see you. Now, the whole immersion thing, immersion as a concept, what you're talking really about there is sensory immersion, as in feeling like you're in the world, but also presentational immersion. So you're making, you're giving other people a sense that they're in the world. Now, all this is doing is it's persuading people that the virtual world is realistic. It's real. Everyone knows it's not, but if it acts as if it's real, then that makes it easier for people to become immersed. What immersion is the sense that you are your character. So the closer you are to believing that the entity in the virtual world is you, then the more immersed you are. All these things that you're suggesting about adding more features, facial recognition, movement, and so on, those will help you be persuaded that the world you're in is a real world. You will have to invest less mental effort in willing yourself to believe that this weird world is a real world. I'm not sure how it's going to work out for people like Pathfinder Lester, who seems to be a spider. That's going to be kind of hard to get the facial recognition on that, but still.
I think he really does have 8 eyes in the real world as well.
Oh, okay, right. Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to start to wrap up. I take your point. I would also observe in relation to one of the things that occurs to me in relation to that growing presentational power, and is that it kind of I almost fear that in a way it threatens some of your early goals with virtual worlds, which was creating an environment where people could operate on a level playing field, where they left the class system and gender and race and social background behind them. And actually,
we don't have to play this world.
No, but once you become fully immersed, well, then you're less and less. Arguably, you're less and less leaving that behind. I mean, you can use voice fonts or whatever, but potentially, at some point, I don't know, it ceases to be a game. Okay, so look, I'm going to ask everybody to express their warm thanks to our panel, to Richard Digvijay and Adam. We could go on and on and on, but we've already run over by 20 minutes, so I am going to be the harsh taskmaster and wrap everything up. I will bring back the clap button, although for some reason I wasn't hearing the claps before. But
yes, we're all taking a survey.
Everyone needs to finish off their survey as soon as possible, please. I am going to hide that survey button, and I am going to stand up, and I'm just going to press a magic secret button that nobody else knows where it is. I hope they don't. I can't see it already, which will spawn a platform for us to stand on. Hold on, let me just go and find it. It's hidden somewhere, and I'm not going to tell anybody where it is. It's over here somewhere. There it is. Hopefully this will then spawn a version of the Matrix in the scene with us. I can see it now to the left. And so if everybody can stand up, and those of you who aren't familiar with walking, you can use arrow keys, WASD, or you can tap the ground in front of you, and we're just going to wander over here while everybody offers their thanks and applause to stand in our relative quadrants. Is that the right term? Quadrants? Is that what they are? I suppose so. On the Matrix.
That's what I call them.
That's what you call them. So if everyone follows us down the stairs, and we'll go up onto this platform, and then we'll take some group photos. By all means, everybody feel free. The spider is getting there first. Where are we? Socializer. I found out that I was a massive socializer, although I was filling in the form at the same time as asking questions, so perhaps not paying quite enough attention to some of the questions as I should have done. But anyway, I was about 80% socializer. And I am going to be very interested to see what percentage of killers. Am I right? The hypothesis is essentially that a good game has an even mix between these four. Is that right?
No, not an even mix. It has a balance. Some of them will be socializer heavy with not so many achievers, a few killers, hardly any explorers. Some of them will be achiever heavy with lots of achievers, more explorers, not so many socializers, but still quite a few, and a reasonable number of killers. Some of them will be more balanced, so they'll have more even numbers of socializers and achievers, and smaller numbers of explorers and killers. And the other fourth stable state is they would be completely empty, because everybody's driven everybody else out. I can't actually take a place here, because this is for people who play virtual worlds for fun, and I don't.
And you don't? Oh, okay. So you're recusing yourself, are you? Well, we do both. We play for fun, and it's our jobs. I knew it. I'm very, very pleased to say.
Oh, that was actually one of our system administrators had that question. We may as well ask it, since I can't seem to see him here. Okay. He was wondering, how long did you actually play Mud originally, and how long did you stay there?
No, well. I never played any MUDs before Mud, because there weren't any MUDs before Mud, and I co-wrote MUDs. So
I think the question was if you actually used it.
Oh, I have played it. Yes, I've played it for hundreds of hours. I've played it for days. To give you a sense of the amount of time I've spent in these, when I quit the Secret World, I had played for over 100 days. As in 24 times 100, that's how many hours I played. When I quit World of Warcraft, it was something like 225 days. It's similar stories when I quit Star Wars: The Old Republic, it was like 50 days. And these aren't just I played every day for 50. This is the number of hours in a day, 24, times 50. That's how many hours I played that game. So I've played these an awful lot, and I must have played Mud more than any of them. But that doesn't mean I was playing it for fun. World of Warcraft, I was playing for credentials.
Well,
so how many times did you reach the wizard level in Mud?
From nothing. The problem here is that officially not at all, but actually I played at least 2 characters up to Wiz level incognito, but people didn't know it was me. So at least 2, maybe 3 or 4. But I mean, every few years I'd start again and do it again. But you've got to create a character to do it, and it's deception. And I don't really like deceiving the other players by pretending not to be me. But I mean, if you want to get the sense of what the game's like on the ground, then you have to do that. But you can't do it if they know who you are, because essentially, if God comes to Earth and then everybody finds out he's God, then he doesn't get treated the same as if he's just wandering around and everybody thinks that he's just the guy who sells fish.
So 2 things to wrap up on. One, as predicted, only Digvijay has had the courage to admit that he is a psychopathic political killer. Everybody else has, as a bunch of craven, lily-livered cowards, skulked and hidden in the easy socialite and explorer. We don't even have any achievers. I mean, I saw Julie wander over there and then hurriedly run away again as soon as she realised that she was there on her own. I don't know whether
the achievers are probably out there achieving rather than coming and listening.
They're not in here listening to. Yeah, it's
not so much the game as the conversation.
The audience. So Richard, you're standing in the middle there. I'm just going to get one last picture if I can. Could you just turn a 180 so that I can bring my camera to look at you with everyone else in the background? And if everybody could turn and look at Richard, stay in your places, but just look at Richard. I'm just going to zoom in on me.
How embarrassing! I feel.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. There isn't a narcissist option here to choose, is there? I suppose. There we go.
I really should have designed my character instead of just picking some guy.
Grab that one. Pathfinder's floating in the air, but we'll just zoom in a little bit. See.
I chose the first one who wasn't wearing flip-flops.
There we go. See, take one more shot, and then we will wrap up. So for everybody, I'd like to thank everybody for coming along today, and we will be doing our next event, just to let everybody know, on a completely different subject, which is the Badass Teachers Association, coming Sunday evening, talking about technology and activism, and we're really looking forward to that presentation. And next Thursday, I think the 2nd, we've got the return of Philip Wells, the fire poet, and his tabla player Sirish. Philip Wells did a couple of poems at the start of Julie's talk a few weeks ago. He and Sirish are coming in to do what we expect to be an absolutely spectacular show of performance poetry. We'll be literally setting the world on fire for that one. But Richard, thank you ever so much for coming in and giving us a talk today. We will share with you the archive YouTube video of the talk. As I say, we could have gone on for much longer, but thank you very much. And I'm sure lots of people will want to reach out to you afterwards and just pick up private thanks as well for joining us this evening.
Okay, richard@mud.co.uk. If you want to email, I'll put it in the chat. So if anybody wants to hassle me about things,
you there, that's great. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for coming along. Thank you for Adam and Digvijay. If you guys just want to say bye-bye as well.
Thanks.
Yep. Thank you for coming along.
And there you have it. You can write Richard Bartle an email and ask him about what he thinks about Sansar, for example, or maybe I should invite Richard to Sansar once we can sit down in my podcast studio. So really fascinating food for thought. I encourage you to chime in on the blog in the comments and have that discussion going. There's a lot of people with strong feelings about Sansar and where the train is headed in various directions. Lastly, I also put this on the blog. Jo has been very busy with the time portal, which I also encourage you to visit. It's really absolutely fantastic. There's a little video that I'll put there. Hell of a job. Jo is also finally has gone to Sansar, so I don't know if she's working on a 1920s Berlin version for Sansar. I have been not Atlas hopping this last week in Sansa, but I have actually been Second Life hopping at The Well. The Well is made by Loki Elliott, and it's absolutely fantastic. The atmosphere that he creates with all that Second Life has to offer, with sound, with visuals, with storytelling, really pushes the envelope. And again, I mean, my hat's off to Loki, absolutely fantastic. I'll link to the video. Strawberry and I and a bunch of others were going through the maze. Of course, quoting Loki from, I think it was 2 years ago, where he said, oh, I figured the Well experience is going to maybe take 15 minutes for the average player, and Draxter's in there for 3 hours. He's still not even in level 2. So yeah, I'm not the gamer type. I mean, you know, Richard Bartle probably would not classify me as that achiever type. But I really enjoyed the atmosphere. It's absolutely fantastic. You got to go in. I don't know how long it's going to be open. It is a Halloween horror experience. If you listen to the show before Tuesday, come on down to Sansar 114 Harvest, the last Halloween hangout, and then we'll switch it back to the normal Harvest. And yeah, that's it for the show. Thanks for listening, and great Sunday. And I'll talk to you guys next week. Bye.
The Drax Files Radio Hour with Jo Yardley is a weekly production of Basic Drax Entertainment. The show is supported by Time Portal, SL Artist, Warbug, Bay City You Know for Kids, 01 Heavy Industries Corporation, Extraordinary, Ionic, Maven Homes, Giza Creations, Botanical, Strawberry Sing, Abranimations, Eros Avatars, Caravel Design, The Cube Republic, What Next, Landscapes Unlimited, Fallen Gods Incorporated, and Death Row Designs. Thumbnail by Justin Esparza. Contact the show via Skype, Drax Files, Avatar Drax Files, or email radio@draxfiles.com.